I cried with my whole heart, hear me. O Lord, I will keep thy statutes. I cried unto thee, save me, and I shall keep thy testimonies. I prevented the dawning of the morning. I cried, I hoped in thy word. Mine eyes prevent the night watches, that I might meditate in thy word. Hear my voice according to thy loving kindness, O Lord. Quicken me according to thy judgment. They draw nigh that follow after mischief.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. We're continuing our study in the book of Psalms today, in Psalm 95. Now let's read it. We may get to a second psalm. I don't know. 11 verses. We'll see. O come, let us sing unto the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving, and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms. For the Lord is a great God, and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the deep places of the earth. The strength of the hills is his also. The sea is his, and he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart as in the provocation, as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me and proved me and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, It is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways, unto whom I swear in my wrath, that they should not enter into my rest. It's almost like the Lord interrupted their psalm. That's how it feels to me. Like, because God speaks. There's a lot of things in the Bible that where it's not, you don't get the sense, thus saith the Lord. But and it doesn't always say, thus saith the Lord. Meaning like Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God this, God that. It doesn't say I this, I that. It's God this, God that. But here, first, man speaks, and then God speaks. His voice comes. Let's look at. Let us sing. So, let's see if there's any. Is there a connect? Because it almost seems unconnected. I mean, it does. It is connected, very specially for Israel. But let's think about it. Let us sing unto the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Human beings, I think, universally make song and music. And, people have often asked out there, I've been asked it only once or twice, actually, myself, because when I was asked, I was delighted to be asked because I hadn't really considered the question from the perspective of an unbeliever, and it was, why should people worship God? What does God need? Because the implication was, why does God demand we worship him? He's the insecure or something? Again, it's because it is appropriate. It's just like children ought to obey their parents, especially young children. Why? Well, why should a 2-year-old do what its parent says? I mean, I'm not talking about necessarily a 16-year-old who may have, I've never had problems with teenage rebellion because by the time they're old enough to think for themselves, I've explained to them sufficiently, usually enough, my reasoning for the rules and the way things are, and they accept and agree with those things, and there is no rebellion. It comes when you have separate lives that come into conflict. Often, a lot of this, teenage rebellion. I don't have it. My teens are my allies. As far as they are helpful to me. I always say that I like children when they grow up. But the point is, as a child should give heed to their parents, especially when they're young, especially when they're a year old. They don't even know to pay attention to their parents. They're like, they're just a lot of things. I don't have a lot of that even, because you can very early on acclimate children to learning to accept no. That's why one of the things I'll tell you as parents, never Let no be no. Do not offer things in exchange. You teach your child to think that every time there's a no, you have to bargain with them. You're trapping yourself. You're undermining your own authority. No is no when I say no, but it's not all the time, and it's not just willy nilly. It has to be, you have to sort of look at it the way politicians like talk about things like political capital. You only have so much to spend. Like you can have arbitrary rules that don't make a lot of sense, but you don't. If you have too many of those, you'll be resented as a parent. Now, mankind is, in respect to God, no different than an infant child. We have such a magnitude of difference between us. And the difference is that we are made in his image, but the magnitude of difference is where it gets at. It's the degree to which, though we are in his image, he exceeds us is immeasurable. So, the way a child adores and borders on worshiping their parents, since they follow them wherever they go, they do as they say. Like God, except you be humble as a child, humble yourselves as children, you shall not see the kingdom of heaven. And there is a sort of point to that. Well, that's why men ought to worship God, because it is, much like children ought to obey their parents, it is the naturally correct thing to do. To sing and to make joyful noises to the God, our Creator, is something that is naturally actually fulfilling to human beings when you do it, when we do it, There's no, like even people who walk away from church and religion often don't have any, is anyone who didn't really like singing in church, or thus singing if it was at least decent? Sometimes that's one of my favorite parts, is just the singing in company together. It's a fulfilling experience. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. We ought to be thankful to God, because God, though, we can say, well, God is responsible for all the hard things we have to endure in life. He's responsible for the fact that we have life to begin with. And you say, Paul, no, God's not responsible for the hard things in life. We're responsible. It's like, well, that's true too, of course. But, the Lord makes the rules. He provided the tree of knowledge of good and evil to Adam and Eve. He put it there in the midst of the garden. He planted it. And man partook. And the consequences were such as God dictated. These are his rules. We live by his rules. And it is not surprising that people resent and don't appreciate God on some level. It's understandable. Because like I said, a lot of it, I think, is because we are intended to feel that way. We are supposed to believe, much like a child, like when the mom and dad aren't home, And you could get up to most anything when mom and dad aren't around, couldn't you? And say, well, wouldn't it be better? It isn't good to leave children alone. Because I know exactly where they would take this argument. Paul, isn't it irresponsible of God to leave humans on their own? No, because we are not entirely on our own. That's the beauty of it. It's like we are not alone. He's with us. It's like because we don't perceive him doesn't mean he isn't there. Because we feel ourselves in danger doesn't mean that he cannot save us out of it. But it is natural and right for human beings to thank God, to be thankful, and to rejoice to God with psalms. It ought to be. This is what man was created for, is to live in harmony with his Creator. Why not? Why shouldn't I be like, wow, so this is what you made me. Wow, that's a great thing. I'm glad you made that. I'm glad you made me. Because, I could have not been made. I could have died in the womb, I might have died in the womb. I was because I was conceived with an IUD. I wasn't supposed to be conceived. That also, knowing that from an early age, has it messes, internal, it does things to you. To know that the world is hostile to your life and does not regard you, that your life doesn't matter, Not to the world, really. It'll just keep going without you. Just bye-bye, we're going on. But God is forever. He is with us always, even to the ends of the world. So I find that making a joyful noise to God with thanksgiving, thankfulness also it is not only right and good to be thankful, it is good for you. Gratitude for good things is an emotion and a feeling, the feeling of which actually promotes good health. It's good to be grateful. Being consumed with bitterness and discontent has never served anyone good in mind or body. Though some amount of discontent is almost impossible. Like restlessness, I should say, not so much discontent. Restlessness, because it is not given always to rest. The Lord himself worketh, and then rests. But there's work and rest. Rest is not the same without work, and work without rest is toilsome. There is work to do in God. Thank God. We're not saved by works, but he has lots of works for us to do. And that should be a rejoicing, because it is good to work with our hands. Whether it be whatever we're working with our hands, whether it's the works of God, which can be worked with the hands, to feed the poor, whatever, to clothe the naked, to preach the gospel, all those things, to serve in the calling wherewith you have been called in your life, to your family and your community, as it were, depending on what the reach you have is. The main thing is we don't want to we can't be secret Christians and have our faith just to ourselves and plant it in the earth. We ought to give thanks, rejoice, make noise about it. You have to be, again, we don't want to necessarily be, there's always that example of the woman who was like, these are the servants of the Most High God, right? And someone once asked me, what do you do when people are, I don't know if I'm going to go, because actually I have a long answer to that. But on some level, you can't control your friends. You can't control who your friends are any more than you can control who your enemies are, which is the short answer on that. And for the most part, people who want to be my friends, I try to tolerate them, even if they're not precisely as I would have them, because I recognize that a lot of things that necessarily maybe I don't like or that bother me are just particular to me. It's more about taste. It's more about, if someone doesn't grieve me, I put up with them. And it takes a bit to grieve. We should not be easily grieved, especially not by brethren. And be condescending to men of low degree, especially those who are new in the faith. There's often a great zeal that comes with those who are new in the faith, and you don't want to just crush it. But on the other hand, you can't allow that to become something that is inappropriate, that draws a negative attention. Because I understand. I've been part of churches where the thing to do was to get up and dance around and praise and sing to the Lord, and people were like hooting and hollering, and I actually thought, well, that's great, and I want to I at times would jump in and was the most hootinest and holleringest of them all. It takes a lot of energy like that, and I couldn't just do that all the time, because it almost becomes like a show, because it does require a certain amount of energy, not only of body but of mind. And sometimes, but then I realized also sometimes, just being quiet and thankful and grateful and just feeling the feelings, feeling the joy. It doesn't have to be with loud demonstrations. We shouldn't also, just as David did, he danced before the Lord as the ark was brought into the city, in his long underwear, his linen, basically down to the undergarments, which was not very kingly or dignified, and caused Saul's daughter to despise him. Or what a king you were today. Fine sight, dancing in your breeches before the whole kingdom. She being a king's daughter, had obviously grown on her. It's funny that will do things to people. My dad was the king, so we don't, and this is the way we behave. There is a certain, and it is good to have some dignity. All right, I get it. But also you have to make room for people to exhibit the full range of human emotions. Like, it isn't right that worship should always be pent up, and that anyone who steps out of, like, the formal way we do things here, like in those places where it's big to jump around, I don't think it was right for people to feel pressure that they had to leap and dance, or made to be felt bad or less a Christian. And not that I felt that there, but at times I felt there was a slight pressure in that direction, like, be more demonstrative. I don't think people should be pressured to be either any more demonstrative than the Lord puts it in them to feel, any more thankful than at that moment they can look and see. It's like, hopefully we can stir up our hearts. I can stir up enough gratitude to bring me to tears if I give myself to it in just a matter of moments. If I have to really think about it. I can't just on command. I'm not that big of an actor, but I'd have to start thinking about things on a certain level. And that's normal, but you don't always feel the same exuberance. But we can always be thankful intellectually, and know we ought to be, and be willing to express those feelings, because it is good. It is good for us, and also it demonstrates our faith to others. The Lord is a great God and a king above all gods. He is a great God. In the Old Testament, sometimes the way they talk about God, there isn't the other gods are in reference. And for the unbeliever, that's why they'll say, like, he's just the tribe of one God. He's the God of one tribe. He's the local God. And though, because he chose a people, Israel, for himself, it made him localized in that regard. But though he was always very much, God was always avoiding that. If you look in the prophets and in the Psalms, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? I've dwelt in tents all this time. Where I don't need a place to dwell. That's something you want. Just like they wanted a king that could see. They wanted a temple, a fixed place where to worship God. And even in the Old Testament, it was declared that this was not the right way, that God didn't want these things there, And then the New Testament is fulfilled. It's funny because the Jews still sort of long for the temple. Even though, look at Isaiah 66, the Lord has already declared, where is the house you would build for me? The heaven is my throne. The earth is my footstool. What is it you're going to do for me? Really? That house was for them. The house is for us. The houses of God are for us to gather and to know God. The Lord there is, again, I forget to mention it very often when in the Old Testament, but I should. When it's in all caps like that in the King James, it means it's one of the places where the sacred name of God, as it is often called, occurs. So it's Yahweh, or Yahweh, as I used to say, but since Arnold Murray was the only one I ever heard say that, and since I don't really trust him on a scholarly level, I don't think he can be relied upon, and so I just steer away from that. Plus, honestly, just one of the reasons I don't always use my music from my first couple albums, all right, for a long time I avoided it, just because when I came out with it, people all started thinking I was a Jehovah's Witness, which really, at the time, I'm like, no, because all the Yahweh stuff, they thought that, I'm like, I never say Jehovah even once. But because that's what people's ignorance is. They don't know all the different sects of Christianity and stuff. They're not hip on that stuff. People don't pay attention to, Yahweh, Jehovah. It's all the same to them. Who cares? But this is the name of God, identifying God personally. I'll say Yahweh because whatever, it's fine. I don't have a problem with it. I heard a guy say Yahweh, like they say it like that. Or I don't know. I usually know him by the name by which he was proclaimed to the English-speaking people, which is Jesus Christ, which is a very corrupt pronunciation of Yeshua, but that is the name by which I received him. That is the name under which I was baptized, and that is the name under which the Holy Spirit showed me his power and entered into me. So I trust in the name of Jesus, even with a little at the end there. Jesus. I'm just kidding. That's a Arnold Murray thing, I think. So that's our God. He is a great God and a great King above all gods. King of kings, as it said. Lord of lords. All things that are called God or that is worshipped. That's what the Antichrist aspires to, that, so that he exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worship. And our God from the Old Testament is even understood then to be a great God, not a normal God like the gods of the heathen. He is a great God, a great king above all other gods. And why? Well, as it's laid out in the following verses, he's the creator. And as it said in the Psalms we were studying previously, thou art from everlasting. The concept that he is from everlasting to everlasting, that is what makes God God. He doesn't have an origin story. Our God has no origin. He is the origination of all other things. He is not contingent on anything. All things are contingent on him. All things are dependent on him. They do not, without him is not anything made that was made or shall be. A lot of times people, that they think, they'll be like, oh, you think this little old man did everything? Isn't that a little old man? The source and center and the reality of all being is at the center of everything. And the creator is probably the best way to understand God, from everlasting. And this creator, when he imagines himself personified, this is the image into which he puts himself. The image which human looks like. And even to a lesser degree, a lot of times, the image of the man is the image of something heavenly. And the animals are also a pattern of that. Of things in the heavens. But the things that are of the earth are patterned after the earth. We're all made of the same dust. And man, as the scriptures say, differs not much from the beasts. Now, that's not a new concept. People notice, like, hey, we're not much different than the animals. No, we're not. We're not much different from the dirt, to be quite, when you get down to it. But we're also very different from the dirt, aren't we? We're also very different from the animals. Oddly and suspiciously and wonderfully different. But on a certain level of analysis, pretty much the same stuff. It's amazing what you can get up to with just a little stuff. In his hand are the deep places of the earth, and the strength of the hills is his also. The sea is his, and he made it. His hands formed the dry land. Again, when I talk about the form, God's form being that, by his word he framed it, the New Testament says. And that word stands in for the power, because God's power is in what he says. At least I think that's how we would perceive it. As far as God says and then things happen, but he makes them happen, obviously. But in his hand, but the idea of he took the dry land and shaped it like that is not. I don't expect that to be literally the case. Like that. Oh, it's a metaphor, obviously. Because his hands formed the dry land. He's being personified as like a craftsman would craft the earth. God crafted it. Because from our perspective, as you know, I mean, because you understand, like, we are these tiny grasshoppers in His sight, and we look up at the God making the world, and we can't explain it, and so it's like it might as well be like a craftsman crafting the earth. God did this, and that's true, because He fabricated the world just as surely as we fabricate the things we craft. But but the idea that his hands formed the dry land, what it means is He personally, because the idea of His hands, it means this is the work of His hands. It's a metaphor that this is what He's responsible for. This is His action. This is what He has put His power into doing. This is His doings. He made the sea. He formed the dry land. Again, it's like maybe people would think it's wrong of me to say like, oh, it's like that His hands part, but it is a poetic way of saying it. Just like the strength of the hills is His. Just the hills? What's about the strength of the mountains? God's only got hill strength. Sounds like you can't take it so literally. In His hand are the deep places. What does that mean? Well, it means, like, what does it mean to be in hand? Well, in your power. In your control, He has power over them, authority over them. They're in His hand. I mean, again, He takes up the nations as a drop of a bucket. They're as a very light thing. There's something you can take in hand is something that's under your power, under your control. I mean, that's what that represents. So He has in His hand the deep places of the earth. Now, do you really think literally God sits around His throne and you look in His hand and the deep places of the earth are actually, they're not in the earth? Literally. Like, literally, the deep places of the earth aren't in the earth. They're in God's hand. Just like His hands literally form the dry. You know what I'm saying? I'm getting, you start taking it to, because you obviously have a mixture very often of, and I was looking at Genesis again because someone wanted to, and we were looking at, I was helping someone think about the shape of the earth. I don't consider it like this big thing, and I'm certainly not going to put it into my Bible study per se. I mean, I'm not going to go into proving the earth one thing or the other. But the Bible is a mixture. And well, because as I was doing that, I was looking at some of that young earth creationism stuff again. This is a video they were talking about it. They were talking about Genesis and the serpent. And they were talking about, how they were like, the serpent used to have legs and it must have walked upright and all this stuff. And I was like, all because on your belly you shall go. Just that one phrase, they had to create this fantasy creature. And also like that all snakes used to walk, or don't they? It creates all kinds of weird. And then when you're thinking about this, it's like you've really kind of totally missed it. I mean, Revelation already makes it clear that it identifies the serpent as Satan. And I don't have a problem if you want to think that Satan took the form of a snake or something like that. But I mean, if it was, again, they were saying, oh, Satan possessed the snake perhaps, or influenced the snake. The snake, I mean, it's like, it makes me think of Balaam's ass. It's like, why are you holding the snake responsible for what Satan did? Like the ass didn't want to die with Balaam. And I guess the snake could be held responsible, but my point is, it's an animal. They don't really talk. And no snakes ever do. But Satan does. And so, I mean, that's the serpent. It's in the story, it's called the snake, the serpent. It's like, but like, when the thing that I noticed on the very next thing, where it says, on your belly shall you go. And they're like, oh, and dust shalt thou eat all the day of their life. And I said, well, snakes don't eat dirt. They kind of get on the ground, they might get a little dirt in their mouth. No, they don't. Because God created them to crawl on their belly. And they're good at it. So they're down there on the ground, and they don't get a lot of dirt in their mouth because they're not dirt eaters. You know what I mean? They're snakes. They're predators. They eat rodents and vermin, not dirt. Obviously, it's a metaphor. On your belly shall you go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of your life. You don't literally eat dust. But they ignored that part. They took the first part literally. Second part, we're not going to discuss because it calls into question taking it all literally. Because in the scriptures you often have a mix of both metaphorical and spiritual and literal, and deciding and figuring out and interpreting what the right balance of that is not always obvious. But the thing is, what annoys me is that the unconscious way people often go about making decisions, that they don't realize they're deciding. They don't realize they're making choices to believe things a certain way, or to take a prejudiced approach to an idea that may be worthy of being questioned, especially when it comes to doctrine. Because people fall into patterns of belief. They're conditioned to read the scriptures in particular ways often because they say, well, that's what it says, replenish the earth. It means the earth used to be populated. Before Adam. Never mind that, again, when people get conditioned into one way of thinking, it's sometimes often difficult to reverse their way of thinking. And it's a very delicate process, because when I get certain of myself in anything, and then someone tries to come against that, there's a lot of emotions at play, including like my own sense of, pride can get in the way easily, because, and we don't want to think it's pride, but it surely is, because we don't want to think we were wrong. We don't want to think we've invested our minds and our effort into things that are wrong. So instead of getting right, we often will just deny we're wrong, which is really a disaster. We shouldn't do that. That's disastrous. We need to acknowledge our wrongs. We need to find them out and face them, at least so that we at least know. I don't want to go around blindly doing that which does not please God. He is the maker of all things. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. It's funny, there's a song, I always remember. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our God, our maker, or something like that. All I remember is, we are the people, and the sheep of his hand, right? Something like that. And I'm like, this song got made into a rejoicing song, which is appropriate, because it's come, let us worship and bow down. Let's kneel before the Lord, our maker. That's what I'm saying. It's like, oh, come, let us, it's the most natural thing in the world. Let us worship and bow down. Let us. It is a privilege to come before God and to worship before him, especially because part of it is, they would have to be cleansed. That's what the sacrifice would be made, that they could be made right with God. That's the point of coming, is to come and to be accepted by God and to be allowed to bow before him and be reconciled. Because all will bow, but not all will be accepted. Every knee will bow, but not every one will be received. So it's important. Let us worship him now, when it's not so obvious that we have to. Because it requires a bit of faith to know that God is and why he should be worshipped. And without that, men still follow their instinct to find the greater thing and follow it and worship it. But often it's something like the state, or a bad philosophy, one of these malicious political philosophies like Marxism and such. That's sort of the answer, the utopian answer to the condition of life and the difficulties that we face in a world that has fallen. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. He is the one who has made us. Why wouldn't we worship him? It's the most appropriate thing to do. It's like, you have made us. We owe you everything. And not only that, we to know, especially the subtext, we have offended, because that's what he gets. So it gets in. He is our God. We are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand, and that's true again today, as this is cited in the New Testament. Today, if you will hear his voice, if you will hear his voice. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. And that's what faith is. You can hear his voice. And that means to truly hear it. Not just because the many men heard Jesus' voice, but they couldn't hear him. They couldn't understand him. They couldn't see him for who he really was. They couldn't hear him and understand this is the one whom God sent. Because unless you were hearing him speak like that, you weren't really hearing him. You weren't really knowing him. Just like his family didn't really know him at first. It seems like that changed, right? Because on the cross, he was affirming his mother to his disciple, or referring them together, and behold your mother, your mother. He said, "Who is my mother?" Right, and implying that people have to be in line with what God wants to truly be, for me to feel that they are part of me. And he didn't feel very unified with his family because they weren't with him the way they ought to be. They were kind of still like, he's beside himself. He's a little crazy right now. He's doing things he shouldn't be doing. That's what got them the whole "who is my mother?" Because they couldn't. His fame was disturbing them. They were trying to say that but we can assume that changed. I think because of what we see at the foot of the cross. And of course it can. But we have to hear God's voice. We have to understand, and that means we not just hear the words, but to understand where the words are really coming from, and understand that this is what God says. And if you don't understand it, that's a problem. That's a problem for us to figure out, or to go to God to help us solve. But my point is, the problem is on my end. People act as though, oh, God, like God's impossible because you cannot reconcile the nature of the world with the idea of God. And that's so not true. And I recognize that many reconciliations of the nature of the world and God, well, they involve a lot of falsehoods. So yeah, they don't match up too well. But the idea that it's not possible is, of course, wrong. You can reconcile reality to the idea of God, certainly. Because especially with the scriptures, because though they say, how can you get the idea of an all-loving God? That there's no idea of an all-loving God. There's no all-loving God. Because they get that idea because God so loved the world that he gave his only, but they read it like that, and they don't understand. It's like, read the whole Gospel of John. Yes, God sending his son is an exhibition of his love towards the world. And is just like he saved the world by delivering Noah from the flood. Now that's also God's perspective on salvation. All right, that was preserving the world, because but even though that entire generation and any descendants they may have had would have been cut off in that. I mean, as in many generations. World War II, I've often cited as like, that I can look immediately and point to that and say, like, my life would not exist if not for all that chaos. I was born out of the chaos of World War II, as far as like, and then it just decades later. I mean, without those events, the world would not be the same. And we wouldn't be in it. So, well, anyway, it's like, to presume that I am a necessary contingency, it's like, it's to deny the miracle of my mere existence. The fact that any one of us exists should be miraculous to us, and enough to startle us into turning to the living God to seek his face. Like I tell people, when I argue with atheists, I mostly tell them to pray to God. I don't really get into arguing with them anymore, because I'll be like, here's an experiment you can do. I want you to seek God. I want you to call in the name of Jesus. You can even mention my name. like whom this guy Paul preached. Or whatever. I don't, do whatever you feel. But don't stop until you get some response. Open yourself up to God. Call on him. It's like they are so afraid to do that. They don't admit the fear. And some don't actually fear it. But like I said, it's like other things. It's like we dismiss it as nonsense because we don't want to confront the thought that, well, if that were the case, then I'd have someone to I'd have to rethink the way I've been living my life. And some people would say, well, if you became convinced that there was no God, would you rethink the way you live your life? I suppose I would say, to some degree, I don't know how you couldn't change, how that wouldn't change you, and not for the good. Like, I can't imagine any good it would do me. You know what I mean? Like, as far as like, it would harm me in many, many ways. Though, like I said, if I believed it, I would think it would be almost inescapable. Because, I don't know, I'm not, like I said, to me, it's like I almost walked away from my faith. Not really, but I mean, I felt like I was close to it anyways. I felt like I was close to not believing at one point in my life. And so, I could see what's on the other side of that abyss. I don't know, but I know that there's nothing happy in it. There's nothing, because even the things of this world, I don't crave than that I've already received. I've already lived a very fulfilling life in the world. It's like I could lose everything I had, but the point was the fulfillment of doing it. Like that it can't be taken away or erased. You know what I mean? Your reward no man can take from you. So we have to have faith. We have to hear the voice of God. Harden not your heart as in the provocation, as in the days of temptation in the wilderness. This is something we are explicitly warned about as Christians. That how all were baptized into Moses in the sea, and they drank from that rock which followed them, that spiritual rock which was Christ. There's all this symbolism that is related to the time of the Exodus, after the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, that is explicitly said, that is a warning to us as Christians to take heed, lest anyone who thinks he stands falls. It's like the implication that you might think you stand in Christ, but it's not true. And that is a fact. There are people who, again, otherwise Jesus would not be able to tell us that there would be people coming to him, many people apparently, on the day of judgment who would say, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? And in your name have cast out devils? And in your name have done many wonderful works? And he's going to say to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who work iniquity. How could he say that to them if it weren't the case? Now, I'm not saying they lost their salvation, because I don't believe in that. Because what I would assert is that they never really had salvation. That from the beginning, though they thought not, it's like they sort of ignorantly took it for granted. They participated in a system and believed, but not really. I don't know. But the point is, we don't want to tempt Christ as they also tempted. Because we know from the New Testament, we've seen examples of those who went too far. You say, can you lose your salvation? Those who go too far never had salvation. That's how God looks at it in the end. It's like, no, actually, I never chose that person. Except if you want to think I chose them to be the traitor. I chose them to be the heretic in the midst. I sent heretics among you to prove those which were approved. That's why there must needs be a heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest. The Apostle Paul said that. There must needs be temptation in the wilderness, so that the carcasses of those that believe not could fall. Yeah? There must needs be false brethren in the church, so that there can be a great apostasy. You have to have a lot of people claim allegiance to Christ and portion with Christ falsely, because the Scripture demands that there be such a thing. I mean, because it says there'd be. So that's why I said, it's like, I believe, like I said, I don't believe you can lose your salvation. But I believe there are people who claim to have salvation, who claim, and somehow, because if you end up not saved, you were never saved. Because the very idea of losing salvation is sort of oxymoronic. You know what I mean? Because like saying I lost my salvation, it's like, what? Because salvation is the opposite of being lost. You know what I mean? You're either saved or you're lost. I lost my saved doesn't make any sense. It's impossible because you were not saved. Salvation is from the lake of fire. It is from your sins. If you can lose that, it would have to, you could only lose it after the final judgment, I suppose, or something like that. And that's funny because I was speculating about the nature of, I was like, well, the angels had it in them to sin. Now, and in the course of doing some looking around, I ran into the Christadelphians, or Christadelphians, I don't know how they pronounce it. And they are an anti-Trinitarian sect who also are kind of universalist. And so they have an interpretation of that. The angels that sinned are talking about like messengers, like Dathan and Abiram and the guys who went down in the game in alive into hell, into the ground. So that's Tartarus. It's like, and I get it. I understand. You can make that interpretation. I don't think that's quite as good because it's like reserve them in the chains of darkness to judgment. They were judged immediately. There's no reservation of judgment as far as I know from those men. That judgment was right in front of everybody. The judge judged between Moses and Dathan and his gainsayers. And Moses came out on top. But even so, in the wilderness, despite God showing them many miracles and delivering them over and over again, as Pharaoh hardened his heart in the face of all the negative miracles. It's kind of like this interesting mirror, where then in the wilderness, the Israelites hardened their heart to God based on all the positive miracles. That no matter how many good things he does for them, when they see themselves in peril, they don't believe. And this is, Jesus sort of really kind of in a very short way, kind of brings that all together when he's walking on the water. Because, again, just like the wandering in the wilderness, it's a situation where it's very normal to feel uneasy about your situation. When I hear about all the bad things going on in the world and stuff, I feel slightly uneasy because I think like, okay, if I had to, if there was suddenly an issue with food supply, what are my options? And the truth is, nobody has any really good options, by the way. Well, some people do. Very few people have good options. Well, nobody has good options. All the options are bad options. It's better that things could keep going and working, than start falling apart. But you feel concerned, right? Because you see, like, okay, there may be an issue with food stability and stuff like that. So you think, like, okay, how many potatoes do I have to plant for my family to survive the winter if I just had to eat potatoes? If that was all I had left, I looked at that question. How many chickens would I need? We don't have enough to feed ourselves. How big of a thing would I? What would I need? Should I do? It may be wise to do that because if I see danger coming, there's this weird duality of like, there's Jesus sitting on the pinnacle of the temple, in obvious danger. And the devil says, throw yourself off. God will give you his angels charge of you. And then you have Jesus walking on the water in obvious dangers. And Peter saying, can I walk on the water with you? It's like, why not jump off the temple together? Jesus, can we jump off the temple together? Let's do that again. It was fun. Whee! No harm. The angels catch us and bear us up in their wings. So there is a bit of don't tempt God, but also trust God. And I look at it as when it's on the line, the Lord will be there. Especially when it's on the line for him. Your life will end when God is done with you and you've lived out your purpose. And then the judgment. And it's not, again, people go, oh, my life. It's like, if you're so concerned about your life, look to the one who provides everlasting life. Look to the one who has the way. Because we're all going to lose this life. We can't hang on to it forever. And look he wants us, we can't, when we see the sea and the waves roaring, it's obviously dangerous. We go through life full of obvious things that could harm us. So we have to walk the balance between not being so fearful that we don't do the will of God or what God calls us to do, and not being so foolish as to rush out into obvious danger. So it's a balance. That's why I say it's something about, that's what people like, they want to say, oh, well, just, when they talk about that passage on their belly, I'm like, they spend like 20 minutes talking about it, and a big section on like, what did it look like, and drawing pictures of what the serpent might have been like with little legs, and just all this stuff. But it's all based on the presumption that little part of that you should take literally. And remember what I said, it's like, it's Satan. And isn't it just the idea that it's connecting sort of the treacherous, murderous serpent, which is the kind of creature what a serpent is. All of them are ambush predators, treacherous. They hunt, whatever. They do all that stuff. They're treacherous, murderous creatures against other creatures. I mean, that's what they do. They go around killing vermin. And they're very crafty, just wise as a serpent. It hunkers down a lot, it tastes the ground. Where are the little critters walking? Where are their paths? And then the snake slithers to a hole that's nearby where the little mousie is going to walk. And when the little mousie happens along his daily trail, the snake strikes and then eats him. That's what snakes are like that. And so is Satan. And that's why he is called the serpent in Genesis. And like I said, I don't have a problem with people if they want to believe he appeared as a snake, literally. I at that point, I'm like, why can't the story just be given in somewhat symbolic form? Like partially, because a lot of it is symbolic. So I don't think God would do that. He would write it plainly so we can understand sometimes. When I always challenge you is like, look at my study on John. Look at the way Jesus communicated with human beings. It's indicative of God himself. He is, he did the will of the Father. He spoke the words the Father gave him to speak. He is the Son of God, the Word made flesh. When it talks about this stuff, about hardening, it's likened it. 1 Corinthians, if you don't know the passage, it's 1 Corinthians 10 or 9. I think it's 10. Or is it 9, 10, and 11? Is that the verse? 9, verse 10 and 11? I think that's where I usually. Like I said, I stopped working to remember verses. Honestly, I stopped trying to remember verse numbers a long time ago. I just gave it the pass. Or the exact phrasing of things. Unless even when I do my songs, they're not always exactly the same. But that's all right. The point is, it's like the precision, the Lord, every word is precious. But at the same time, we have to know what the words mean, the signification. Like the Ethiopian eunuch in the chariot. How can I understand unless some man should teach me? Because on some level, like I said, how do you balance out that? Is it literal? Is it symbolic? What is the story here? What is the true truth? Which part is being, and being able to learn how to suss that out with using tech, at least so that it's reasonable. Because I do believe God does things that are reasonable. His ways are past finding out in some ways, but he has reason for what he does. Sometimes it may be just this way was the best in my estimation. Among, he could have made the world maybe many different ways. He could have made this life occur and this world exist. There are different ways he could make it. I don't dispute that. God is not totally constrained by some principle outside of himself. He did it this way because this was the way which to him was pleasing to do it. And that is the reason on that front. Wait a second. What was I going to? Oh, I just want to check that 1 Corinthians. I think it's 9:10, or is it 10:9? No. Oh, it's 10, 11, 12, right. That's 9 is one about the living in the gospel. Yeah, it's 10, 11, 12. Those are the verses. Now these things happen to them for examples and are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. 1 Corinthians 10, 11, and 12. Chapter 10, verse 11, 12. But it talks about these same things, the things they did in the wilderness. I would not have you ignorant, brethren, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all did eat the same spiritual meat, and all did eat the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Again, that rock was Christ. Now, it didn't mean that there wasn't a rock there. Like I said, that's why you can have a serpent in the garden, true, but the essence of what that was Satan. And the pronouncement against it was not a pronouncement against snakes, because Satan is murderous and treacherous like a snake, and it's connecting that murderous treachery. He was a murderer from the beginning, with the fact that murderous treachery ultimately and always, God from the beginning has ordained utter humiliation. On your belly you will go. That is low down. And you will, such treachery belongs licking up the dust. It's connecting those things using the idea of a snake, because a snake is a treacherous, murderous thing. It's saying this treacherous, murderous creature in the garden tempting man to do these things, his punishment is to go on his belly and to lick up dust. Which in some way is literally how the snake goes, but other ways is not. Snakes don't eat dirt. Okay? The idea is subjugation, humiliation. It's the humiliation of Satan. He may be that though you will, he says in his heart, I will ascend into heaven, yet he shall be brought down to hell. But thou shalt be brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. All they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and shall consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble? Is this the man that did shake kingdoms? That made the world as a wilderness? That opened not the house of his prisoners? All the kings of the nations, all of them lie in glory, but you are cast out of your grave like an abominable branch, like the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with the sword, like those that go down to the stones of the pit. That's what it says about him. So the serpent is humiliated. That's that's what that means. And the serpent refers to Satan. Whatever you think was really going on in the garden, as far as what was physically going on in the garden, the reality was it was Satan. That's what was the ultimate reality of that situation. It was not about changing the nature of snakes. But the nature of snakes is used to describe the action of he that is called the dragon, he that is called the serpent. And like I said, it's like if you need to picture a serpent in a garden with people, fine. I'm just saying, like right there in Genesis, you have it's obviously symbolic, licking up the dust. That's not how snakes live. I mean, if you're going to take that as zoological information, you have to go the whole way. You can't just cherry pick. And that's what they do. They will cherry pick the evidence they use, the parts of verses they will look at and say, this is literal, and we'll just not mention that. That's why I do line-by-line Bible studies. I try not to skip over clauses that give me difficulty. I confront them. If stuff, say, this verse in particular is difficult for me to deal with because of my beliefs, I think that this verse needs to be heavily interpreted, and to just admit that. Because my job is not to make you a clone of me in terms of what my opinions are, Because when I try to make you a clone of my opinions, that's when heresy really becomes damaging. When I need to make you believe the same little off things that I haven't straightened out yet. When I need to convince you of them, I become a kind of a more dangerous heretic than just a benign one, where you may have an idea that's off, that's not right. So, Paul, you believe in benign heresy? Well, there's some worse than others. And the thing is, almost all Christians have to be heretics. Almost all of us have to be heretics because we don't agree on anything. At least, and so those heresies have to have different varying degrees. But none of them please God. So we want to seek the same perfection in doctrine that we do in our outward behaviors. I mean, we seek it. I don't expect to see it in my brother, but I want to help him aspire to it. I look to myself. I compare myself with who I was, and I try to see myself getting more like Christ. I try to manifest the behavior so that I may observe myself actually. I don't want to just mentally imagine that I'm like Christ. I want to actually observe myself. That's why I say see myself. I don't mean an internal image. I mean I want to visualize the reality of being like Christ. And I want to make that vision come into being. That is the whole work that after we receive salvation, that's what I'm about, man. That's what we ought to be about. I get it, because I remember hearing people from different denominations when I was young and I didn't understand things. They're saying, well, why wouldn't you want to do God's will? Exactly. Why wouldn't you? They would say that, they generally affirm that people who believe in things like eternal security, that those who are saved, that God inspires them with the appropriate amount of faith. And sometimes just enough. That's why I was capable to nearly lose my faith, because God dealt me a measure of faith. And perhaps because he gave me so many measures of other things, he said, no one gets too many gifts, Paul. Sorry. Not that I have so many. But whatever. To deny, when I was a kid, they put me in a class and they called it gifted. And then I went on to do things and people would be like, oh, you're so gifted. You're unique. Blah, 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 blah. It's like, it can conspire to give you a big head until you realize it's like, yeah, there's also millions of other people in the same gifted boat with you. It's like, it's not necessarily with every kind of power comes some kind of responsibility. Just because you have gifts, so many people waste all their gifts. I've never been able to fully use mine myself. I'm not the man I want to be. I'm only coming along, and that not as fast as I would, but then, God is in control. And, part of what we walk in is learning to trust God. Again, we don't want to grieve him, though. They tempted me. They proved me. They saw my work. Boy, and I feel weird. We got to end because I have to go. I have to literally jump in a car in 4 minutes. And I don't feel comfortable just being like, that's it. We did kind of cover it. I want to see, because I may just carry it into because the subject is similar. So I'm going to probably, maybe I'll read 2 Psalms at the beginning and talk a little bit more about this, because I feel like I mentioned we went to 1 Corinthians and we read it and it was a nice reading and all that. And I cited the passage I quoted before from memory. Isn't it funny because now I can't remember what passage I quoted. That was from, you know where it's from. I know you're yelling it at your computer right now. but yeah. Anyways, so I want to take. I'm being distracted even now because I realize I have to go. So instead of breaking myself trying to catch up with where I was, we'll just. We're just gonna. I'm gonna say we're gonna pick it up from verse 8. We've covered sufficiently the idea of today if you hear my voice and the necessity of faith. And we cover it all the time. But these things, we need to repeat them over and over again, and to repeat them so that we never should forget them. And that's the thing, is like we think we don't want to be as forgetful hearers. That's what there is a danger of that always. We don't wish to tempt. Because we know we can become forgetful. So we don't want to tempt, I hate saying tempt the fate or tempt God, but in a sense, by ourselves being unattentive to the things that we should be mindful of. We then become what we ought not to be. Inattentive, and we need to. I do think that though God gives us things, He inspires with things. It is in part to so that we would feel. I think like a kid learning to ride a bike without the training wheels. He's guiding and holding and there, but he wants you to pedal. Pedal the pedals and go and do it. I will help you. I'm right here with you, like a child being raised by its parent. Because that's very much similar to the situation we're in, except the difference of magnitude is so great. And that also accounts for our childhood is like kind of, it's childlike, it's simple, it's beautiful. There's a lot of beauty to it and simplicity. And also, we don't see, and when we think of the adult world as being so harsh, it's like, well, God's world is pretty harsh too. And this world we live in is actually very much like a nursery. More so than we ever could realize. I think that will be manifest. Anyways, we're going to look at verse 8 to 11 a bit more tomorrow. Because it's worth it. It's strong. And I still didn't really cross the bridge of like connecting the two. So we will, I'm pretty sure, get into Psalm 96 too. So we may read the two back to back at the beginning and then look at the end of Psalm 95. And then we'll go from there. And I think we're going to go up to Psalm 100 or so. It's going to depend on what we got right there. I haven't looked ahead yet. But somewhere around Psalm 100 we're going to break. And we'll go do a New Testament book. And then we'll come back and do something else in the Old Testament. Maybe a few more Psalms too and stuff. Okay, thanks for joining me. We're looking forward to being back again tomorrow. Till then.
I cried, my whole heart, hear me. O Lord, I will keep thy statutes. I cried unto thee, save me, and I shall keep thy testimonies. I prevented the dawning of the morning. I cried, I hoped in thy word. Mine eyes prevent the night watches, that I might meditate in thy word. Hear my voice according to thy loving kindness, O Lord. Quicken me according to thy judgment, they draw nigh.